We've been looking at Longuenu's passage as quoted by Charles Taylor, and basically we're looking at the conception of humanism. And our concern is just to use this passage to understand a conception of humanism. So we are not specifically concerned with Longuenu's thought as such. Okay, so I'm just going to sum up what we said or discovered in the last two videos, and then I'll try to sum up this. So here goes. So we looked at a few things. The first thing was, generally speaking, humanism is valorization of humanity. And in the historical context, what it means is you elevate humanity from its position or station as a creature of God or subservient to God, and elevate him to the station of a god of some sort. And this godhood then is obviously theorized and understood in many different ways. The potential god, or actual god, or etc. And this obviously requires a replacement of the position which God held within Christianity, for example. But doesn't necessarily mean rejection of God, although it ultimately leads to actual or potential rejection of God, or practical rejection of God. So God becomes really an instrument of the greatness of humanity or human beings, or humanity or humans become co-workers of God, or co-companions of God in a sense. So that's the first thing. And in a sense, what is important here is people get into this what I think is a futile exercise, where they say, well, whether he believes in God or not. But what is important is not whether somebody believes in God or not. What is more important is, what is your conception of God? And the same applies for when people talk about if he is rational, or if this theory is rational or not. So the main thing before that is, what is your conception of rationality? So what is your conception of God? Your conception of God might have changed to a certain extent, that even without rejecting God, you have actually practically rejected God. And that's what happened normally at the start anyway. So what has happened is, the conception of God has changed with the new conception of man. as a potential or actual God. So that was the first point. And the second point which we made was that this valorization of God, at least in one very important modernist tradition, is understood as or through the concept of autonomy. And this has a crucial resemblance to Christianity and other Judaism and other religions in that tradition, because Christian or Judaic God is autonomous in the sense that he is self-sufficient, doesn't depend on any other will in any sense, and so it's independent. And also, so that's negatively, and positively, he determines his own will. So self-determination. So this sufficiency of God has two horns, like he's not dependent on anybody else, and is only dependent on himself. Is determined by himself and nobody else. So that's what autonomy means, self-determination. And in Islam, so in Surah Al-Ikhlas, for example, when we say Kul Huwallahu Ahad, God is one, Allah Samad, He is Samad, As-Samad. So As-Samad means this very thing, self-sufficient. In this sense I just described, that is, he doesn't depend on anybody else outside himself, or he's only dependent on himself, so he is autonomous. So this new valorization of humanity, or its elevation to the station of God, was conceptualized with this conception of autonomy, that humans are autonomous, or humanity is autonomous, or they should be autonomous. So there are two. So there's always a conception of potentially, so they have potential to be autonomous. So how to make them actually autonomous? So humanity and humans are godlike in the sense that their humanity consists in being self-determined. They're autonomous, or they should be autonomous in both senses. They shouldn't be dependent on, or their will shouldn't be dependent on anything outside their will. And even if they realize any God, the God will is only binding if that God wills become their own will, that they will will God's will. So in that sense, they don't depend on any other will, and their will is determined by their own will. So that's self-determination and autonomy. So it is exactly the same concept, which is the concept of as-Samad, or Christian concept of self-sufficient God, a Judaic conception of self-sufficient God. In fact, Judaic conception of self-sufficient, because Christianity had already compromised self-sufficiency of God when God needs man to actually reveal himself in a person of in a person who is fully man and fully God, that is the Jesus Christ, Adhan Allah. So the valorization of humanity is conceptualized in terms of autonomy, and like Christian and Jewish and Islamic God, this human being in his individuality or as a species are self-sufficient. They are autonomous, either potentially or actually. Um, this leads us to the third. And as I said, this leads us to the third point which we made is this dialectical dialectical relationship between this new humanism and Christianity. And the way I describe the second point also paves the way for this third point. And this third point, and it's very important to understand this point because it's not easily understood, and it took me a long time to understand it. And I'm still trying to understand it, obviously. Is that on the one hand, as Nietzsche and others saw, humanism requires the death of God, the Judeo-Christian God, because man in fact replaces God. Now this doesn't require rejection of God, but it's a practical replacement of God. So humanity as a whole and humans as individuals will no longer be subserving or submitting their will to the will of God. That's negative speaking. And they will only submit their will to their own will. So in that sense, Nietzsche talk of the death of God. But on the other hand, this same humanism also, and that's the dialectical error, humanism also requires Christian God. And there is no humanism without Christian God. At least at the start. That's why there was no humanism before Christianity, for example. I mean, there were people who talked about man as measure of all things, like in Greece, and there were Stoics who talked about independence, but their conception was very different, cosmic, as we'll look at it in the next part of this this quotation. And I think Foucault, among others, sees this point or makes this point very well when he says that with the death of God, death of Christian God, man also, we must look for death of man as well, because this man cannot live without this God, the Christian God. And this is because this man of humanism and modernity is fashioned after the image of the Christian God. So there's a Christian God who was self-sufficient, Christian and Jewish God. Now you have said human beings are potential or actual God. In that sense, they are self-sufficient. So if you didn't have that conception, you wouldn't have this conception of man. In this sense, humanism, although it rejects Christianity, it basically replaces Christianity. It also cannot live without Christianity. So there's always this question lingering at the back. And as Christianity is slowly dying or will die, then humanism in its original form will also die, and we will have to come up with something new, and then it becomes a crisis for modernity, as you see in postmodernism. They talk about post-humanism and all that. We don't need to go into that. And this dialectical relationship between humanism and Christianity, and humanism and modernity, is difficult to understand. So that's why, some Christian, say that, humanism is a Christian thing and modernity is a Christian thing. And, those modernists who reject Christianity, they are out of their mind, etc. And they are correct to an extent, but they also, many of them don't realize that it's not just the rejection of or acceptance of the Christian God, but how the whole conception has changed. So in that sense, humanism, so also a rejection of Christianity, and modernity is also a rejection of Christianity in a very crucial sense we just described. And one of the reasons and one of the consequences of not understanding this dialectic is people get into these debate about, for example, Kant, who is a very important modernist thinker. Some people think he was a Christian at heart, despite all his thinking. Others say no, he wasn't Christian. He was, even though he was an atheist, he made fun of Christian God, and he has a very minimal influence from Christianity. And so, for example, in an Anglo-Saxon Kantian scholarship, you will see people of this sort, like Beiser, for example, says that emphasize the Christian roots of Kant. On the other hand, Manfred Kuhn and Wood, for example, they are big on non-religious Kant, etc. And I think both are right. They are both right because, in a sense, like humanism, Kant cannot exist without Christianity, but also, like humanism, it also transforms the very meaning of Christianity and Christian God. So it's not this or that, but both camps are saying something crucial, but what we need to understand is how to join these two inside. So this leads us to the rest of the paragraph. So I'll just read from the start so we have a context. Fundamentally, humanism is the conception and valorization of humanity in its capacity for autonomy. What I mean is that what constitutes modernity as a civilization, as a new era, which replaces medieval Christianity or Christendom, is the fact that man thinks of himself as the source of his representation and acts as their foundation or their author, like the Christian God. So the man of humanism is the one who no longer receives. So that's what we did up to this point. So we'll look at the rest of the paragraph now. The man of humanism is the one who no longer receives his norms and laws either from the nature of things, that is Aristotle, for example, nor from God. like Christianity, but who establishes them himself on the basis of his reason and will. So that will come. So this is the actual. This is the actual practical manifestation of the godhood of humanity or humanism. They replace God as the legislator and moral lawgiver. Thus, modern natural right is a subjective right, posited and defined by human reason, not just human reason. So this reason is different from Stoic reason, for example, that is juridical rationalism, or by human will, that is juridical voluntarism. So that's juridical rationalism, that's the law, and juridical voluntarism, that is the moral, that's the morality. So we'll get to this now, explain this and finish up this. So positively speaking, we said that humanism is the notion of the self-sufficiency of humanity, either in their individuality or as a species. And this self-sufficiency has two horns, that humans are not dependent either factually or normatively on anything other than their own will. Will is important as well, because the Christian God, the main thing is his will, isn't it? That's so different from Aristotle's God. It doesn't have will or anything. It's just a cosmic force. So this is a personal God of a specific sort. Always. So in the negative sense, will is not dependent on factually or normatively on any other will, including God's will if God exists. And positively speaking, this will determine its own will factually and normatively. And this positive sense, factually, that it gives itself, this will is self-sufficient, that is, it determines its own self factually, what it wants to desire, what it doesn't want to desire, what it wants to do. And normatively, it also determines its will normatively, that is, what should he do or what she shouldn't do is also determined by himself, herself. Okay, so this is the concept of self-sufficiency, or what in Islam we call samadiyat or samad of a sort. So the man of humanism is the one who no longer receives his norms and laws. So the man of no longer receive his law, so norms and laws. So in Christianity or Judaism, these norms and morality, laws, what we call Sharia, or law of God, Christians call it, and Judaism it's namus or nomus, or law, that come from God. Yeah, so that's Christianity in their own way. Christianity, Judaism, norms and laws come from God, and human laws and norms must be either deduced from those laws, or based on likeness to them, or based on inference from them, etc. Although Christianity, and that's one of the reasons maybe that humanism came out of Christianity and not Judaism and Islam, because Christianity compromised this conception of God at the outset at least starting with the Paul, when he rejected the law of God and said the law is curse, which is a horrible thing to say as far as Judaism and Islam is concerned. Anyway, that's a separate. So before humanism, norms and laws either came from God, as in Christianity, Judaism, or in Islam, or they came from nature, as in either Aristotle, for example, in Greek civilization, or Plato, or even Stoics and etc. Because their rationalism and their humanism is a very cosmic rationalism, and Aristotle's God is mainly a cosmic force. And people try to, obviously in Islamic philosophy like Ibn Rushd and Ibn Sina, and these people try to read Aristotle as believing in a personal God, but we should remember that Aristotle's God is a cosmic force. It was posited to explain motion, really, explain Aristotle's physics. Aristotle's God, basically, his physics is explained through his metaphysics, which is his God. And one of the things which Aristotle God lacks, many things which he lacks as compared to Jewish, Christian, Islamic God, is the will. And this will is important for humanism, as we saw. So before humanism, norms and laws either came from God or, let's say, nature. So that was what people call Abrahamic tradition. And this is Greek civilization, or pagan civilization as a whole. And yes, so that was, but humanism is neither this nor this. It says law must come from man. As an individual, that is liberalism, and that tradition, individualistic tradition, or species, and that is communitarian and more humanity as a whole tradition, like Hegel and Marx. Although Marx is a more complex, he has more, his conceptions are the amalgam of liberalism and communitarianism, or individualism and communitarianism. So humanism differs from both the Abrahamic tradition and the Aristotelian Greek Platonic tradition in that sense. That's why, and here he sums this point very well. He said the man of humanism is one who no longer receives his norms and laws either from the nature of things, that is Aristotle, naturalism, nor from God, but who establishes them himself, that man, on the basis of his reason and will. So that's a reason and will is human reason and human will. Thus, so that's an example. Modern natural right is the subjective right, posited and defined by human reason, juridical rationalism, or by human will, juridical voluntarism. That's why in humanism, both norms and law come from man, either his will or reason, or like Kant, you can combine this will and reason. An example he gives is the norms in modern morality, like Kantian morality, where human beings, as one of Kant's commentators has said, that Kant actually invented the conception of morality as autonomy, that human gives moral law to themselves. So they legislate moral law in the same way in which Christian um, um, God legislated moral law. And moral law, and the actual Sharia, or your law with which you live, you organize your societies, you organize your relationship, that comes from human beings as well. That's so human as self-legislator, and that is reflected in modern democracy, which is very different from Greek um democracy, in this, that its core institution is the parliament, where what you do is legislate. Humanity legislates for itself against the natural laws and against the laws of God. So this sums up, finishes that. So we'll go back and read it, and then finish this series. So fundamentally, humanism is the conception and valorization of humanity in its capacity for autonomy. What I mean is that what constitutes modernity is the fact that man thinks of himself as the source of his representation and acts as their foundation, subject, or their author. The man of humanism is the one who no longer receives his norms and laws either from the nature of things, like in Aristotle, nor from God or Christianity or Judaism, but who establishes them himself on the basis of his reason and will. And that differentiates humanism from Stoicism, for example. Thus, modern natural right is a subjective right, posited and defined by human reason, juridical rationalism, or by human will, juridical voluntarism. So this sums up a brief tete-a-tete with Monsieur Alain Renou's passage as quoted by Charles Taylor.